Josh Naiman, and you are listening to Episode 2 of the Belief Books podcast. If you don't already know, my purpose for this series is to simply talk about beliefs and document those conversations I have about them in the form of podcasts, videos, and even books. So I'm interviewing people to talk about what they believe and why. For episode 2 of the Belief Books, I decided to jump to chapter 2 right away, which I named Duality. For chapter 2, I've decided to explore the topic of science and faith. I'm interested in how people see those realms and how they interact, or if they're disconnected, or do they overlap? How do people define faith, and what role does science have to play in all of that? There's a lot to unpack there, so I think the best thing we can do is to start talking about it.
I've spoken with God. I don't necessarily have a relationship with God. I see God in people. I see godliness in nature. And I think like all of the above is totally cool.
That is Dori Chandler. I was connected with her after I recorded a Citizens Climate Lobby sponsored event up in Michigan. That was this past April for Chapter 1 Denial. I realized pretty fast that I needed to connect with the Indianapolis chapter so I could get involved. Enter Dori Chandler, who I now consider a constant motivator and friend. Dory is an environmental planner, activist, and educator. She works with nonprofits, governments, universities, and faith communities to promote energy efficiency, renewable energy, eco-justice, and waste reduction and reuse. She is the statewide coordinator and group leader with Citizens Climate Lobby, an organization working to create the political will for a livable world by passing climate change legislation, and a board member with Hoosier Interfaith Power Light. She also works with students at Butler University right here in Indiana. In this episode, we talk about her environmental activism and how that connects with her faith. She explains some details about Judaism and clarifies some things for me, how she defines faith and views science, and what you can do to get involved in climate activism and activism in general. And I should also add that I chose to include a relevant but short audio clip that I thought was useful, but it has a little profanity, just so you know. For episode 2, we start in the sewers, literally.
One of the things I did as a kid was walk in the sewers with my friends. We would call it a sewer walk, like every Saturday afternoon, go on a sewer walk after services from this synagogue. So it was really interesting to put those two parts of my life into action and find a way to connect with that part of my childhood and nurturing, and then realize, from both my faith and from seeing the problems in the world that I needed to participate in solutions.
Yeah. So what age did that switch happen?
Probably in high school. I started developing relationship with some teachers my science teacher, I remember my biology teacher being a real mentor for me, and also my English professor. And so learning about critical thinking and science, and I was also in a Jewish high school, while at the same time learning about religion. And then the real critical, I think, moment for me was I participated in an opportunity for high school students to go to Washington, D.C. on a program put on by the Religious Action Center, which is a part of the Reform movement in Judaism. And they teach Jewish students from high schools around the country about issues that are happening in the world, and then you go on the Hill and you lobby your congressperson about them.
Any issue.
They picked a number of issues. The one I remember lobbying on, or two I remember lobbying on, were gun control and raising CAFE standards, corporate average fuel economy standards for cars. Those were the first two issues that I lobbied on.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I kind of want to capitalize on this because with this production and this series, how can we use some of this information for people who might be in high school or at that stage? Like, how, I ask, why don't more people have that connection, or why isn't that switch happening now more? You would think like, okay, there's got to be this huge wave of a new generation that's like, okay, wait a sec, this is not good. But it seems like we're still like battling something. Is it because older people are still running things, pulling the levers? Or, sorry, that's a two-part question. So what does a high schooler do, and then why aren't more, or that age, why aren't more people making that switch?
Yeah, so let me see to break it down. For the first part, why aren't more high schoolers participating, or how can we get high schoolers to participate? I think doing programs where, we often teach in schools about how our political system works, right? We have the Capitol, we have 3 branches of government. This is how the legal part works. Here's how the executive branch works. Here's how the judicial branch works. Here's how the legislature works. But we don't talk about, what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to be a citizen who's putting besides voting, to get your voice to be a part of the political discourse and dialogue, and how do we participate in government? And there are a lot of programs out there, mock government, and I actually did participate in a program like mock court for teen court, and that was really, really cool. And I think those programs are extremely positive. And I think everyone should be required to go to their state capital and not just see it, but talk to their legislators about the issues that matter. Because while they may not be able to vote yet, they are going to be potential voters, and their voice does matter.
Please, just don't vote. Don't vote.
Don't vote. Don't vote.
No, seriously, don't.
You don't care.
What's the point? Don't.
Don't vote.
Don't vote, really.
This is one of the biggest financial disasters in American history. Why would you vote? Why would you vote?
Who cares? The economy's in the toilet. Who gives a shit? I don't care. I got so much money.
Don't.
Out of the question.
Don't vote. Because who cares about, your children's education?
Reading, literacy? Really?
You're right. Don't vote.
It's a bad idea.
You don't have to.
Who cares about global warming and the fact that
Our polar ice caps are melting.
I hear polar bears can swim.
I forbid you to vote.
Stay where you are.
don't vote?
Because who gives a shit about terrorism?
The right to choose, the right to life, the right, any right.
I got 19 kids. Never used abortion once.
Seriously, do not vote. Voting is absurd.
It's ridiculous.
Who cares?
About the war on drugs?
I've never fought a war on drugs. I've never done shit on drugs besides played Halo 2.
Do not vote.
There's no point.
Why?
Who cares about Darfur?
Darfur? I don't even know what the fuck that is. That sounds like a t-shirt company to me.
You don't care? I don't care.
Don't vote. Whatever you do, don't vote.
Nobody's listening to you. So, hey, you know what?
Fuck it.
Don't vote unless you care about health care.
If you think that everybody deserves to be taken care of when they're sick, then
Maybe you should actually reconsider. Maybe you should vote.
If you care about gun control,
Women's rights, civil rights,
Rising gas prices.
Social Security.
the war, then you should vote.
I mean, you could vote if you care about welfare, minimum wage.
The economy, gay rights, abortion rights,
Education. First Amendment, Second Amendment, all the amendments.
Or your future, or the world, or a country.
Everything.
unless you cared that what you felt about these issues might be exercised.
I care. Does that matter to you? Because if it does, then maybe you ought to vote.
Going to the second part, I was talking to a woman the other day who said her community around her, lives in St. Louis, a lot of people don't believe that their voice matters. Somehow there's been a really good marketing campaign to suggest that our voice as citizens doesn't matter, and it's convinced a lot of people that their voice doesn't matter, and that by communicating with their representative, that it's not going to do anything, that certain people will always be in power. I don't think that specific groups like the Tea Party is actually small but mighty. The National Rifle Association also, very small but mighty. Why? Because they speak out. NRA has 1 million members, and people who are alarmed or concerned about climate change, this is from a Yale climate study, are around 40 million people. But because our voices aren't as loud or haven't been communicated to government because we may think that our voice doesn't matter, we've stepped back and not engaged. And so a big part of this is convincing people through whatever mechanism we can that if you don't speak up, no one will hear you, and that thankfully we have a democratic system that it does matter. And politicians do think that. While citizens don't necessarily believe their voice matters, politicians, when you interview them, say that they do pay attention to citizen comments and to their constituents.
That's good to hear, because that's what they're supposed to do, like literally representative. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And at least we have this system in place. So yeah, like taking advantage of that. You work closely with the environment and then what's going on with the environment. So like, for instance, a topic like climate change is very like data driven, and like this is happening, we can see this is happening, we need to act on it. So you have that science component. You said that you're involved in an organization that gets people of faith to address this.
I am involved with an organization called Hoosier Interfaith Power Light, and that's part of a national organization called Interfaith Power Light. And the goal of that organization is to help faith communities engage in actions around climate, but specifically around energy efficiency and solar energy, and making their congregations more green, and taking those sort of ideas from the science perspective and putting them into actions about how can your community engage with this.
Just curious, do those processes or whatever methods that they use, have you applied that to non-faith entities like businesses, like the mom and pop pizza shop or something? Or is that something that's on the radar on like, hey, we're doing well transitioning these churches, synagogues, whatever it is, to this green way? Have you guys thought about venturing outside the faith community, or is there just so much work to be done?
That's a really good point, and I think right now the organization really focuses on the faith community, because while science may drive many of us to act, a lot of us also act on our notions of faith and how we respond to our spiritual and faith-based perspectives on the world. And so the faith perspective really helps communicate a message that otherwise might not necessarily come through the science perspective. And I think a lot of businesses, their framework is maybe more economic or profit-driven. And a lot of these faith communities, it's around what are we doing to make the world a better place? How are we focusing on our mission? What do we want the future to be for our communities? How do we want to support people from all walks of life who may be a part of our community? So it's a messaging, and also it's kind of approaching it from a different voice.
Yeah. I also think that pastors and priests, from the pulpit, that's a big microphone. Like you were talking about the loudness of 40 million voices versus 1 million. There's a lot of people who go to church services and things like that and take that really seriously, who's the spokesperson, what they're saying. So are you encouraging them to be more vocal about it, essentially, to their congregations, or get the discussion going?
Yeah, we have trainings. Hippo has trainings for faith leaders to help them articulate this message from the pulpit. I think you're exactly spot on that faith leaders magnify the message and can articulate it to their communities in a way that speaks to their community.
It came up organically a couple times when I was up in Michigan in a couple interviews, and we were talking about climate change, but they talked about Christianity, and they brought up the church. That it's interesting because there's two sides of, let's just say, a Christian. They can either look at it and say, look, here's the earth and God made it for us to use, and just it's ours. And then there's another side of it who it's like, no, we're stewards of it and we need to take better care of it and leave it better. And so there's these two lumps. You could justify your actions this way, or you could justify them in this way. I don't know where I was going with it as far as a question, but it was just an observation. I would think that a person of faith would feel the obligation to, okay, this is sacred, right? This is our only home and it was given to us, so therefore we should take real good care of it. That should be number one. So it's really awesome to hear that there's like an organization specifically addressing that problem. You are in the Jewish community. I'm not so familiar with Judaism, but is there like a specific denomination?
Yeah, so Judaism has a spectrum very similarly. I would consider myself part of the progressive or liberal Jewish community, but I also come out of a postmodern age, so I'm non-denominational or whatever, but I'm raised in a conservative and reform congregations, and I went to a community day school and a pluralistic Jewish high school.
Can you explain reform and pluralistic?
Yes, so reform it's a progressive denomination of Judaism which espouses a lot of the tenets of tikkun olam, repair of the world. And it came out of Enlightenment ideology that said that science and thought and philosophy are all important and that we don't have to hold them in a distance from our own faith, that we can incorporate them into faith perspective. So it really came around the same time as other Enlightenment thinkers and came out of Germany. And so it's really today one of the largest denominations in the United States.
So that's reform, and that's kind of the name of that denomination, if you had to give it a label.
Yeah, reform, and then conservative came out of a sort of compromise between Orthodox and Reform Judaism. It's a halachic movement, meaning it tries to retain a lot of the legal structure that Judaism has within it, a halachic framework or a legal framework that was passed down through a dialogue of rabbis and spiritual leaders throughout centuries about how do we live a Jewish life. That's not necessarily based, it comes from the Torah, comes from the 5 books of Moses, but then it also comes from additional discussions and dialogues through the Talmud and additional books afterwards about how do we live a Jewish life. How do we take something that says you shouldn't boil a kid in its mother's milk, not child, but baby goat, and how do we take that one line from the Torah and apply it to our life? And halachic Judaism would say we turn that into a whole thing called kashrut, or keeping kosher, so not eating milk and meat together. And so what does that look like? And conservative Judaism tried to maintain that dialogue, as well as saying that, science is real and that women also should be accepted. That's a big part of it, is also where women play a role.
Yeah, things that should be just a given. So that's good to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah. The nice thing about science is it is what it is, regardless if you believe in it or not. Mm-hmm. So mine as well, just accept it. But I respect Judaism specifically, I think, a little more than other faiths, in the fact that, like, you hear a lot of people who are like atheistic Jews or whatever. There's all sorts of different factions, but it seems like it's more of a community rather than, oh, if you don't believe it, like Scientology, you have to disconnect from your mother or your daughter.
Judaism is a culture and a religion. Yeah. And so you can have different perspectives on religion but still feel an identity. And, it's more from a time when we were a tribe, right? An Israelite tribe, or whatever that might have looked like historically. So there's a historical identity as well. And different groups say that how that religion is passed down, whether or not it's through the mother, that's a common thread, is, you can tell who the baby belongs to because it came from the mother. But at the same time, there's sort of class culture that's passed down through the father. So there's the Levite and Kohanim, the priestly class that's actually passed down through the father in some communities. Reform Judaism has rejected that as a concept, but you can be a Kohen or a Levite or an Israel, and those are sort of from this Israelite identity that is still kind of present in the community.
Huh. I can ask one question. It's like this wormhole opens. I even just got to thinking, I still, even though I was raised a Catholic until, 8th grade and on, I'm very familiar with Jesus and that he was the king of the Jews. And then how did there become Christianity and still Judaism if he was a Jew? Like, it totally still confuses me. I don't know if it's just because I haven't been explained to it like really cut and dry or something. It's just kind of this lingering, like, yeah, it's just like the thing. But I never have been able to put that puzzle together.
Yeah, well, he came out of a time where during the Second Temple period, where there was a lot of different groups breaking off. There were the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes, and he came out of the Pharisees and kind of was another perspective. And then Paul really took, what Jesus said and turned it into a religion.
But Jesus was a Jew?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
he's a rabbi.
So interesting.
Yeah, religion is pretty amazing like that.
Okay, I wanted to take a minute really quick to thank anyone and everyone who's given me support, motivation, and feedback up until this point as I've been creating the Belief Books over the past 2 years now. From friends to family to the helpful and extremely positive podcasting community out there, I only hope I can express my thanks and give back with the work that I do for this series. I've already been getting messages and feedback on this project, which is really encouraging, and I look forward to getting more suggestions or questions as I keep posting more episodes. Here's a motivating tweet I got early on from someone who goes by Nurture Nature at NNUS on Twitter. Love the Belief Books concept. You need to post the interviews on YouTube so you can post them on Twitter and elsewhere easily. Best. So I am posting all the episodes and the other video clips on YouTube. And I will make sure to post everything I create on Twitter too. Just search for the Belief Books and you'll find me. Thanks for your suggestion and the support, Nurture Nature. In the second half of our conversation, we dig deeper into Dory's faith, science, how they interact with each other, and what she does as a communicator and activist in this realm. We also find out what it would take to change her mind. So I like to get people's definitions of certain things. So like how people would define faith or how people define belief or something like that. Do you have a specific thought about this is what I consider faith, or like faith for me is this?
Yeah, I was thinking about that actually a lot the past week, and truth came up, faith equals truth, but I wasn't satisfied with that. And faith, it's really interesting because for me, my faith dictates a huge part of my identity, and that is the collection of my relationship with my family, my community, my history, my culture, my religion, and my emotional identity. A lot of faith for me is what is my emotional identity. So it stemmed from this idea of, okay, so faith, a lot of people talk about a doctrine or trying to attempt to find some kind of relationship with God or community or truth. But I think for me, it's this connection to all those different components of my identity and how I develop that relationship with myself and the people around me.
So in that whole explanation, I didn't really feel like you were tying it to an entity other than yourself or the people around you. Is there another faction to that?
It's really interesting. I guess the question is about God, right? And about, belief in an entity or faith in, Judaism for me has never obligated me to answer the question, but it's obligated me to ask a lot of questions. And so, personally, I've had a relationship or a voice that I've used when I talk with an entity or being that's greater than me. Maybe I'm a little bit comfortable with sort of a humanistic perspective where we find God in people, but then I'm like, scratch that. And I read Abraham Joshua Heschel, who's a rabbi who talks about God in time and space and nature. And I connect with that too. And so I've spoken with God. I don't necessarily have a relationship with God. I see God in people. I see godliness in nature. And I think like all of the above is totally cool. So that's where this is a constant exploration of what that means. And I love being Jewish because it gives me a framework to say, yeah, why don't you ask all those questions? Why don't you explore all those possibilities?
That's awesome, because my experience with that realm was not that. So I respect this lens. It sounds like, like almost like pantheism, like where everything is God.
The words that we say when we're declaring our faith is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel. I don't like saying Lord, but Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Hear, O Israel, God is our God, God is one. I mean, maybe that is an encompassing, saying like, you can see God however you envision God, and we're all in this together.
That's awesome. Because first off, that's true, and that's going to happen regardless. Like, I have heard someone say, I don't think it has a root of who said it, but however many people there are in the pews of whatever church or whatever, that's how many different gods people believe in, because everybody has a different thing that they take from like a book or the traditions and stuff like that. If you interviewed everybody in isolation like this, everybody is going to have a bit of a different way of explaining faith, and that's kind of the cool thing about it. And then we can get into, okay, now what's your definition of science? But, well, maybe we just should.
Well, we even say in Judaism, like, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, Right. Okay. So in faith perspective, like, yes, yeah.
Well, it's interesting because most people, their definition of faith is that, like, almost the explanation of reaching a conclusion. Yours didn't seem necessarily like that's how you reach your conclusions. So it actually, I don't know where the transition is into how. My biggest thing, I guess, in this chapter is where science comes in to play. And like, why is it that, you have to work on a council or in an organization that tackles specifically approaching the faith community? What is the barrier where faith and science meet? Why is there not more overlap? Or do you think there's a lot of overlap? Do you see a lot of overlap?
Let's start with the definition, or my definition of science.
Perfect.
So, because I think that's where you were starting. So science is inquiry, science is intellect, science is hypothesis, science is logical explanation, attempting logical explanation. Science is being inquisitive, and those two, faith and science, can meet, and they do meet, because the faith questions often overlap with science questions. Their end results may be different, or maybe the same, I'm not sure. But science maybe is exploration for exploration's sake, right? And faith is when we take exploration, or we take this inquisitiveness about what the world is made up of, and give it a form and a shape, and say it's because we want to make the world a better place, or it's because we want to, humans are here on the earth because we want to have a beautiful relationship with whatever we consider to be God or not God, or solve poverty, or solve a problem. And science is like, okay, what are the challenges and what are the problems, and what can we explore and examine about them? So oftentimes those two, you do see scientists helping to solve challenging things, and you do see faith trying to explore what it means to be a person. So I do see that there's overlap. I keep going back to emotion and logic and intellect, right? That there's some kind of thing that, not left brain, right brain, or even emotional intelligence. I do think there's a reason that we say emotion and intellect, or logic, because those are two parts of ourselves that we're constantly navigating. So in some ways, I feel like the science part somehow speaks more to No, that's not true. It doesn't always speak to our logic. But I was going to say science maybe speaks more to logic and faith maybe speaks more to emotion, but maybe more in the extremes that might be helpful. Like I was thinking today about who do we have in our religious communities that we find maybe on the extremes. And those are people who've rejected inquiry, who've rejected that there could be other opinions. And that's not a very scientific perspective. And also, it's a limiting perspective on how we can relate to the other. We can relate to someone who's different than us. Right? Somebody who believes wholeheartedly that their faith is the only faith and that everyone else is doing it wrong doesn't have the capacity to ask the questions anymore. They're not asking questions anymore. They're saying, I know what's right, and they're closing their perspective to what other people, and I think that's a dangerous perspective, and that's on one extreme. And then you have people on the other extreme who are very scientific and very logical and can't necessarily relate to complexities within human experience. Don't understand how to relate to somebody when they're dying. I mean, you hear all the time of the doctor who goes into the room and is like, you're dying, or like, sorry, like this is the end, or, I don't know, go, whatever. So like there are these two extremes, and I think it's important to somehow meet in the middle. And I think that's what a lot of progressive faith communities have tried doing, is saying there's benefit to seeing a logical framework for how we relate to the world. And there's benefit to seeing how we can believe something and it provides a lot of value to our life. And even if it is kind of weird, like a ritual that doesn't necessarily make a lot of logical sense, but it provides us with joy, or it provides us with connection. So I don't know, I think that there's a beautiful place to meet in the middle for both of those.
Yeah, there certainly is utility to a lot of beliefs that even if it, like you said, it's something different, or like, I don't know why we're doing this, but there's a utility for it. What do you think is the thing that gets in the way? How are those two extremes, how can they start to come together more? Like, because I get why someone would be kind of shut off on either side. What's the way to start to bridge that gap, I guess, or start that conversation? What's the one solution? The Pope had to come out and say, climate change is a real thing, or whatever, and that was a big deal.
He is a scientist and someone who embodies faith and science. And I've been really impressed by the way that he's spoken about these issues. To have to convince the President of the United States that climate change is an issue, to have the Pope do that, just seems like such a complex, it just seems like a total turn, a flop. And yet religion has been there as a source to ask these questions, like what, why are we here? What is the purpose of this? So, and in a way he's actualizing something that's really important within his own faith, and I respect that. So how do you bring those two together? I think a lot of times we think that they're in opposition, and that's okay because it's important to be able to differentiate and distinguish. But I don't see them in opposition. I think some people have tried to use one to answer the other. For instance, I've heard people try to say, well, the creation story is a metaphor for actually what the scientific process of evolution was. So that's one way that you can do that. You can say, oh, well, the 4,000 or 5,000 years that the Bible says creation happened in, it was actually, the 6 days of creation, it was actually like this billion years it took from the first day to create the Big Bang. And then day 2 was, okay, microorganisms or whatever. And day 3, they slowly crawled onto the, Earth. That's another billion years. I mean, I don't know the scientific analogy for that, but you can play that out. I don't know if that's necessary, because people are able to hold multiple truths at the same time without their head exploding all the time. And sometimes we don't give humans enough credit, but it's possible to say, yeah, creation in the Bible and in our perspective may have happened in 5,000 years, and evolution happened in this billion years. What does that do for us? Okay, let's hold them both. Okay, great. If you're a creationist and you say that I can't hold one without negating the other because that would say my belief in God is totally negated, like God can't exist now, then that could be a challenge for you. But you can also say, wow, God also gave us the capacity to think both of these things at the same time. How amazing is that? That we have maybe you see religion in a literary sense, and you say, oh, well, this is the way that we pass down this knowledge in a time where we didn't totally understand the science. How cool is that? Or you could say scientifically, the creation story kind of may have been the early people writing about what they imagined, and maybe those two things are kind of similar, but yeah, I think it's possible to hold both at the same time.
Yeah. Well, I think if you can allow yourself to ask questions or be willing to revise your thought or whatever it is based on what comes in, but right when you start to lock the door and build the wall in your own echo chamber, you don't want other things coming in, so you get these huge extremes. Yeah, but you'd said, some people try to make sense of one using the other, and it goes both ways. So I totally agree that that's great to try to do. And I think this plays back to someone of faith can use science to prove something like climate change is happening, and therefore we need to take care of the creation more strategically for the future and things like that. So yeah, I don't think like in any of these conversations I'm going to be able to go, okay, here we boxed it up and here's the pretty bow, So I think it's more like brainstorming, and hence this project. I think conversation is one of the most important things to do, to start, at least just to start to talk about it, because the worst thing for anything like politics or religion or whatever it is, that if you don't talk about it, then it just becomes this black box that no one wants to touch. But yet it's such a big elephant in the room, because no matter who you are, you probably fall somewhere on a spectrum and you have some interesting insight. I gotta figure out how to wind down from a conversation like this. I guess I'm curious, your day to day, what are the things you do or the methods that you go about when you're communicating with your faith community and through the organization that you work with? What are some of the things that you do, and any specific methods that you try to communicate better?
So for me personally, Judaism has a built-in mechanism for taking a step back and holding perspective, and that's the Sabbath or Shabbat. And that's from Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. And no matter what's happened in my life, that has been an important part of how I reconnect with my community and reconnect with my spiritual essence. And it's also how I connect with my environmental part. And that actually does run in conflict sometimes, because sometimes I'm like, I really want to be with community, but I feel really guilty right now burning fossil fuels, because I try to take a step back on Shabbat and say, okay, how am I using my the resources of the earth? Because the earth deserves a Sabbath just like I deserve a rest. That the earth serves me and I serve the earth during the week. And can we let us both have a chill pill, right? So I think being a part of a community that celebrates Shabbat, that celebrates the Sabbath, and really making that a part of my ritual, of my day-to-day practice, has been really important to me. And I also started a green team at the synagogue that I belong to continue to have that conversation about how we can engage in other ways during the week as well, including looking at solar and energy efficiency for our congregation, and community-supported agriculture, which is a way to support local agriculture. So it's been really incredible to be able to work within the Jewish community, and also as a Jew working in the community around me, to have these discussions in the interfaith community. Oftentimes people worry that when they have discussions with people of different faiths, that they're going to somehow lose something, an essence of themselves. But that does not happen. What's gained is so much greater, and a deeper appreciation for who you are and what your perspectives are and what your faith is. So I've really appreciated the work that I've been able to do with the interfaith community, both Hipple and in other positions. And so during the week, I do the work of protecting the earth and trying to sustain humans, because sometimes it's hard, but I think, humanity has a beautiful essence and we have so much to give the world, and I really hope that we can find a way to live in a mutual beneficial relationship for both the earth and for humanity. And then on Friday night to Saturday night, I'll step back and just kind of take a breath and look at the beauty around me and appreciate that.
Yeah, I think, and I've had some other conversations, one with Dave Behrens, who was the former meteorologist, and he put it really nicely that right now we just have a problem with that we're so connected, but with each other in like the most deep way because of our phones and the internet and stuff, but we also are so disconnected from what we should be connected with and what we are connected with, whether we are hyper aware of it or totally ignore it, and are stuck in our screens. But, like that, I think it would be advantageous to have this disconnect. It came up with Nikki Rothwell in Michigan in that conversation I was telling you about, where we were talking about climate change all this time, but then talking about time to step back and be with family or think about the stuff that just went on throughout the week, so maybe I'll have to adopt something like that. I think that would be a cool method. What is the term for that?
It's part of, the Shabbat, the Sabbath, and unplugging.
I like to ask for any interview this question, which is depending on like your stance. So let's just say with climate change, you could think about that, or your faith, but in any realm, what does it take to change your mind?
It's a great question. So I love reading. I've always loved reading, and I really like learning about different perspectives. And what helps change my mind, I think, is being able to understand someone from their perspective, understand where they're coming from. And it's interesting, changing my mind doesn't necessarily mean I will disagree with what I believed before, but it means opening up my mind to what other possibilities are and perspectives are. So I may politically learn about someone who may disagree with me and understand where they're coming from and understand their notions and really put myself in their shoes. And at the end of the day, I may still believe what I believe, but I think my mind is open to the possibility of what somebody else could believe and why. And that ability to see different perspectives has enabled me to be a better person, to be a better friend, to be a better leader. And it's also just a lot of fun at the end of the day. So that's something that I encourage everybody to really challenge their notions of what they think by listening and by understanding where other people come from. Because there's this fear somehow that it's going to take away from who you are if you understand the other side. And I don't think that that's true. I think it only enriches it.
I couldn't agree more. Once I started to open up a bit, just based on education and reading and stuff, the more you dive in, the more interesting it gets. I don't see any downfall to learning more or exploring more, because you can only become more correct, or at least more diverse in your way of perspective about things. So, I was going to ask you, like the last question I asked, like, okay, what would you leave someone as far as advice? But I think that's pretty solid, unless you had something else. My other thing is just, if you wanted to say any organizations that you work with and want to plug, how can people get involved with what you're doing or do their part?
Yeah, so the only other advice I would say is, again, your voice matters, and getting out there, and while being open to other people's perspectives, also getting politically engaged, expressing your opinion is really important, and we all need to become active citizens. We're not a democratic country of voters. We're a country of people who actually get out and do vote. So it's extremely important to live in a democracy, to participate in democracy. So that's the other thing that I really, really believe. And the organizations, it's okay to do both.
Plug away.
So I would highly recommend Citizens Climate Lobby. That's an organization that has enabled me to think outside of my box and be able to really enrich the discussions that I have. Hoosier Interfaith Power Light is an incredible organization working to here in Indiana and also IPL across the country to engage in discussions of faith and science and climate. So as we move forward, just also, find the organization that you connect with and get involved.
Yeah. I think that's a great place to put a little bookmark in. And maybe we can dive deep into CCL and climate change stuff another time.
Cool. Very cool.
So I guess one call to action for this episode is to act in some way to make the world a little better. To think hard and then act. I think Dory would prefer that. If you want to act on climate change now, you should, and you should check out Citizens Climate Lobby. Their website will give you all the information you need and how to get involved. That's citizensclimatelobby.org. There's most likely a chapter near you. If you're interested in becoming involved in the interfaith earth care movement, look into Hoosier Interfaith Power Light at HoosierIPL.org. All the links and information on these organizations and other content covered in this episode can be found right on thebeliefbooks.com. So, thanks for listening to the second episode, and thank you so much to Dori Chandler for coming on the podcast and talking about her work and beliefs. If you like what I'm doing, you can support me for as little as $1 per month on Podbean's Patron program. You can find more information about how that works and what you get on Podbean on the support page of thebeliefbooks.com. But it's really simple and will go a long way to helping me do this more and do it better. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or directly on the website, where you can listen to more episodes and find more information and resources. You can leave a comment on this episode directly on the website, or leave a review on iTunes, or just send me a message if you like this series and have ideas on how to improve it, or suggestions on future topics, or if you would like to suggest someone be a guest on the podcast, or if you would like to be a guest on the podcast. Just email me at beliefbooks@gmail.com. I'll see you on the next episode of The Belief Books.